we've had wonderful music. We've talked about the visual arts, and we're going to move to the written word now. The Haury Program is connected to writer Francisco Cantú, originally through the Haury Faculty Chair and poet Alison Deming. In 2017, Dr. Deming, through the University of Arizona Creative Writing Program, launched a companion program to her Grand Manan Island Field Studies in Writing. And this is called Field Studies Southwest, which is also gets support from the Haury Program. Masters of Fine Arts students spend 2 weeks in Southern Arizona exploring how literary and documentary arts can create humane responses to environmental, social justice, and border issues in the region. Recent MFA alumnus and Grand Manan Field Studies alum, Francisco Cantú, coordinates the Southwest project with Susan Briante as faculty facilitator and ethnobotanist Gary Nabhan as consultant. The students work in collaboration with the Borderlands Earth Care Youth Institute, a program sponsored by the Borderlands Habitat Network, engaging marginalized youth in hands-on restoration work of the local ecosystem while providing leadership and educational opportunities. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about that program. It's a wonderful program. But now, please welcome Francisco Cantú to read from his new book, The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border. It's a valuable contribution to dialogue and understanding about living on and with today's border.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And also just in general, thanks to the Haury Foundation. I'm glad you mentioned the work that I've been able to do with the support of the Haury group. And also, I'd like to acknowledge all the challenge grant projects. I know how much goes into those applications and all the work that goes into coming up with those projects that are already in existence and that we hope will all continue. And great job. Also, it's an honor to sort of be in conversation with Carlito's work. I spent some time in the foyer, or the Canyon Courtyard, as I guess it's called, and I really encourage y'all to go spend a moment with his art and to get close to it and to listen to it. So I'm going to read a couple short excerpts from my book. The book sort of mixes research and narrative, and as a way to sort of ask readers to grapple with the ways that our border policy and border enforcement dehumanizes migrants and normalizes violence. So I'll read two short pieces of research and one longer vignette. In an exhaustive study of news coverage in multiple borderland newspapers, Jane Zawiska, a cultural sociologist here at the University of Arizona, surveyed 10 years' worth of reporting to determine the most common metaphors used by journalists writing about migrant deaths. Economic metaphors were predominant, characterizing migrant deaths as a cost, calculation, or a gamble. Death is the foreseeable outcome of a cost-benefit analysis with measurable, calculable risks and consequences. Death is the ultimate risk in a game of chance, the unlucky result of a roll of the dice. Metaphors like these, Zawiska writes, naturalize death and suggest that migrants bear some responsibility for their own deaths. Violent metaphors were the second largest category, depicting death as the vengeful punishment of an angry desert or the casualty of war waged along the border. In such discourse, deaths were blamed on unforgiving weather, on lethal immigration policy, on a lack of enforcement against an invading army of migrants. Dehumanizing metaphors constituted Zawiska's third category. Here, migrants were depicted as animals, persecuted prey of smugglers, law enforcement agents, and militant vigilantes. Lured to the border by the prospect of well-paying jobs, migrants engage Border Patrol trackers in a cat and mouse game with deadly consequences. A related metaphor, writes Zawiska, depicts enforcement agents as humane shepherds tending to a flock. This illusion reinforces the humanity of the Border Patrol while it dehumanizes migrants by portraying the Border Patrol as saviors. An associated livestock metaphor, widespread in Mexico, casts migrants as chickens and smugglers as chicken ranchers, pollos at the mercy of their polleros. Another subcategory of metaphors describes migrants as dangerous waters threatening the nation, a metaphorical home. Enforcement is represented as an effort to staunch the unwieldy flow of migration, the border as a barrier to be plugged and sealed against a rising tide. The corresponding death toll is a surge, and the bodies are part of a flood of migrants that overwhelm Border Patrol agents and medical examiners. It is here that Zaviska cites the work of Otto Santa Anna, a sociolinguist at the University of California, Los Angeles, who argues that, ontologically, such metaphors dehumanize migrants by representing them as an undifferentiated mass. When the call came out on the radio, I braced myself for the smell. That's the worst part, the senior agents would always say, the smell. During my first week at the station, one of them suggested I carry a small tin of Vicks VapoRub with me wherever I went. If you come up on a dead body, he said, rub it under your nose or else the smell will stay with you for days. I arrived at the scene in the still hot hours of the early evening. Hart had already been with the body for 30 minutes. It's fresh, he told me, maybe 2 hours old. It doesn't smell yet. Hart had been flagged down by 2 teenagers as he was driving across the reservation. They put rocks in the road, he said, gesturing awkwardly toward the boys. He stood with his hands in his pockets and then asked me if I would talk to them. They keep asking me questions, he said. I can't understand them. One of the boys was sitting on a rock, looking disoriented. I went over to him and I asked how he knew the dead man. Es mi tío, he told me. He stared at his hands as he spoke. How old are you, I asked. 16. I looked at his friend, standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. And you? He looked up from the ground. 19, he said. The dead man and the 2 boys all hailed from the same village in Veracruz and had set out together on the journey north. The 19-year-old did most of the talking, telling me that a few hours before the man died, he had taken 2 Settlemerk pills, caffeine uppers that border crossers often take for energy, and had washed them down with homemade sugarcane liquor that they had brought from Veracruz. A few hours later, he said, the man was staggering around like a drunk, and then he collapsed. I walked over to the body. Hart had placed a shirt over the dead man's face. I lifted it and looked at him. His eyes were closed, and he had long, dark hair that already somehow looked like that of a dead man. White foam had bubbled up and collected between his lips, and his face was covered with small red ants traveling in neat lines toward the moisture. His shirt was pulled up at the sides of his abdomen, and I could see where his skin was turning purple with dependent lividity as his blood settled to the ground. The 19-year-old told me that the 3 of them had become separated from their group. Their guide had told them to spread out, to hide in the bushes by the road to wait for the load vehicle. They must have gone too far, he said, because sometime later they heard a car stop, and then it drove off, and after that they couldn't find anyone. Alone at the edge of the road, they walked for several miles in the August heat until the dead man finally laid down to die. The boys waited beside the road to flag down one of the infrequently passing cars, but no one stopped for them. That's why they put the rocks out, they said, to make the car stop. The boys asked me what would happen with the dead man, if they could come with the body to the hospital. I told them that they could not, that they had to stay with us, that they would be processed for deportation, and that the body would be turned over to the tribal police. They asked if the body would come back to Mexico with them, if they could bring it back to their village. I told them that they could not, that the body would be taken to the county medical examiner, who would try to determine the cause of death. I told the boys that they would be taken to sector headquarters, where they would meet with the Mexican consul, and that it was the consul who would make arrangements for the repatriation of the body to Mexico. As I spoke, the man's nephew stared at the ground. Maybe the consul can provide you with some documentation, I suggested, something to take home to your family. The boys didn't want to leave the body, and even as I explained the procedures to them, I began to doubt, given what I knew from my short time on the border, whether they would actually see the consul, whether the consul would actually arrange for the body to go back to Mexico, whether the boys would even receive so much as a piece of paper to help explain to the dead man's family what had befallen him on the journey north. As I spoke to them, Hart came over and instructed the boys to take off their belts and shoelaces. I looked at Hart. "Transport is coming," he said. Another agent, junior even to Hart and me, arrived to transport the boys back to the station. He brought a camera to photograph the body, and as he took his pictures, I noticed the dead man's nephew watching in a sort of trance. I explained to the boys that the pictures were required by the police, that they were needed for the reports we had to file at the station, and then he nodded his head as if he had heard and understood nothing, like he just knew that's what he was supposed to do. Before the boys were loaded into the transport unit, I went to them and told them I was sorry for their loss. "It's a hard thing," I said. I told them if they ever decided to cross again, they must not cross in the summer. "It's too hot," I said. "To cross in the heat is to risk one's life." I told them never to take the pills that the coyotes give them, because they suck moisture from the body. I told them that many people died here, that in the summer people died every day, year after year, and that many more were found hovering at the edge of death. The boys thanked me, I think, and were placed into the transport unit and driven away. The sun had already begun to set as I left the body, and it cast a warm light on the storm clouds gathering in the south. As I drove toward the storm, the desert and the sky above it grew dark with the setting sun and the coming rain. When the first drops hit my windshield, I could hear the dispatch operator radio to Hart, who had stayed behind with the body, that the tribal police didn't have any officers available, and that he would have to wait with the dead man a while longer. Later that night, at the end of our shift, I saw Hart back at the station and asked what had happened with the body. He told me that finally the storm had come, and dispatch had told him to just leave the body there because the tribal police wouldn't have an officer to take charge of it until the next day. "It's all right," he told me. "They have the coordinates." I asked him if it had been strange waiting there in the dark, watching over the body of a dead man. "Not really," he said. "At least he didn't smell yet." We stood for a few more minutes talking about the storm and about the human body that laid there in the desert, in the dark and in the rain. And we talked of the animals that might come with the night, and of the humidity and the deadly heat that would come with the morning. We talked, and then we went home. Historian Timothy Snyder has spent much of his career examining the terror waged against the people of Eastern Europe between 1930 and 1945 in the borderlands between World War II-era Germany and the Soviet Union. In his book Bloodlands, he chronicles the twin genocides perpetrated by Hitler and Stalin in modern-day Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and Western Russia, campaigns of ethnically and politically motivated mass killing and starvation writ large. Snyder implores his readers to view the staggering number of deaths, 14 million, as 14 million times 1. Each record of death, he writes, suggests, but cannot supply, a unique life. We must be able not only to reckon the number of deaths, but to reckon with each victim as an individual. Snyder explains that to join in a large number after death is to be dissolved into a stream of anonymity, to be enlisted posthumously into competing national memories, bolstered by the numbers of which your life has become a part, is to sacrifice individuality. It is to be abandoned by history. Snyder ends his book with a plea to academics and fellow historians, to all people who grapple with death on a grand scale. It is for us as scholars, he urges, to seek these numbers and put them into perspective. It is for us as humanists to turn these numbers back into people. Thank you.